Okay, this is Steve Bonacontri from SOA Consulting Services, back with our Angular 4 tutorial. We were discussing, previously we discussed the architectural aspects of the Angular 4 routing, and this lecture we're going to talk about, go through some router examples showing you several different examples of programs. One of them is going to be a router, which is going to use the hash location strategy. The next one is going to be a router which displays errors and also warns the user when the user navigates away from, let's say, a form which might not be saved, etc. We'll talk about an example which uses history API-based strategy, and we'll go through a navigation example, a parameters example, and a router child example, and we'll go through an example which shows auxiliary routes. So let's get rolling here with the development. Okay, so I have all these applications loaded. Let's go through them right away. So let's look at the first example, okay? And I'll go through this. So how, just to show you how you should go through an application to figure out what the application is doing. Okay, so we have an index.html, and it has an app route component. It's a custom app component, so it basically is an Angular application. So I look at my CLI program, which basically shows me that my main app is main.ts. I look at main.ts, and it looks like it loads, it uses Angular Core, and it uses Platform Browser Dynamic, and basically it imports an app module, and it will bootstrap an app module. And it determines whether it's running in production mode or development mode. Okay, so let's look at the app module. Here's your app module. Okay, now notice, so we're importing several things here: the ng module for the annotations, the browser module, the app component, the home component, a services component, and it imports the location strategy, which is a hash location strategy from the common library. And it also imports routes and router module from the router. I'm going to call it a featured module. Okay, so the first thing we do is we define certain paths. We define a routes object, which is of type routes, and we use two. We actually define the path, and we define the component. And the first path defaults to the home component, and the second path has a services value, and it points to the services component. And then we use the router module to pass the routes object into the router module and define it for route, and then we import that routing. Okay, so the ng module, the app module, imports the routing, it imports the browser module, and it has declarations: app component, home component, services component. These are my custom components that I'm building. And it also has a provider. Notice the provider is the location strategy, and it uses a class called hash location strategy. And then we bootstrap the app component. So there's several things we are doing here for routing. Is we're using the routes and the router module. We are defining a routes object. We're defining, passing that to the for route function of the router module, and we're importing that router module. And then we're also providing the provider, which is the location strategy. Okay, so let's take a look at our components. Okay, so we have an app, a home, and a services. So here's the app component. So the app component imports the component from core, and that's used in the annotation, and then it has an app component. It's empty. The class is empty, but the template defines some router links. One router link which points to home, another router link which points to services, and it defines a router outlet. So when I click on this router link, home, the home component should show in the router outlet. Why? I'm sorry. Because the app module says when the path is empty, it renders the home component. Okay, so I think we understand what that template looks like. Notice I'm using the backtick marker here to do a multi-line template. Okay, so let's look at what the home component looks like. It's basically it imports the component and view encapsulation. And I'll talk about view encapsulation later, but the important thing to notice is the selector is home, and this is the home template. Home component, this is the content of the home page. So all I'm trying to show you is when you click on that link, it's going to render this component template. This component template is going to render, I am the home component, and I'm pointing to a styles here, so I might have some styles here to color things differently. So let's look at the services component. The services component has a selector services, and when I define a template, I say, oh, I'm the services component. This is the content of the services. So now let's go and try to render. Let's try to run the application and see what happens here. Give it a chance to fire up. Meanwhile, let me go and fire up the Google browser. Okay, once again, I got my environment files, and I'm basically saying production is false. And let's see if I have a style for the page. I do have a style for the page. The body is turquoise. And let's see what else I need to look at here. This is taking a long time. Okay, the server is going to listen to port 4200 on localhost. This is pretty unbelievable. Okay, now it's building the modules. Okay, so let's see what happens here. Okay, so here basically what's happening is we're rendering the application, and by default the home component showing in the router outlet, and when I click on services, the service component renders. So it's just a simple example on how you use the router. Now notice, home, I have a URL, services, I have a URL. And let's see what happens if I do something here. It's basically probably defaulting to the prefix. Let's see what happens if I do this. Somehow it's defaulting to the prefix. But anyway, just wanted to show you a little bit about how the router works. So let's move on to the next example. Okay, so the next example is going to be a 404 error display inside the router outlet. So let's take a look at let's at least first run this so we don't have to wait so long. And let's take a look at the code. Okay, so once again we have index.html with an app root. We have a main module which loads an app module. It does a bootstrap on the app module. The app module is here, and here we have several routes. Same thing. We include the routes in the router module. The location strategy is the hash location strategy. We have an app component, home component, service component. Now we introduced a new component, a new 404 component, and this time, when the path defaults to the home component, I could navigate to the services component, and anything else will go to this not found 404 component. So let's take a look at the 404 component. It basically says, not found 404 component. Dear friend, this URL is not found. Okay, so let me just fire up Internet Explorer and see what happens here. Okay, so by default it renders the home component. Then I could render the services component. Okay, let's look at my route. My route has /services services, and then let's see, services component, template, and let me go to Google and see what happens with the same app. Okay, so I don't know why Internet Explorer was having a problem, but so home, services, and any other URL which is not recognized, we will render this not found 404 component. Dear friend, this URL is not found. Just to show you, the H1 ID is error, and my style for ID error is red. So I deliberately did that to demonstrate. And notice all the components are using, well, this one isn't, but this one uses the styles URL. This one uses the styles URL. Okay, so that's a way to default to a route using the double asterisk. And you'll see this done different ways on the internet, but this is I think the proper way to do it. Okay, let's go to the next example. Okay, this is the app-based reference. Okay, so this is fairly simple. What I'm going to do is first, what I'm going to do is let me go to the example and let me start it so we don't have to wait. Okay, so once again, let me go through this really fast. Index, you have the app root. Main, you have a module which is bootstrapping the app module. This is the main driver to bootstrap the app module. And then you look at your app module. I don't know what's happening here, but okay. So you look at your imports, and here in your app module, what you've added is an import to an app base href from the Angular common package. And you're no longer using the hash strategy. So once again, you define your path for your home component, your products component, your service component. You include all those. Here I've done something a little bit different. I've defined my routes as my route object, and then I've imported the root module for route routes, and then I declared all my components I'm using. And here my provider now changes. The provider is app base href, and I'm using a value /. Okay, so let's take a look at what that looks like now. Now notice the URL. The previous example had a hashtag in the URL. Okay, now I have a different app running. When I go from home to products, there's no longer a hash symbol in the URL. So that is the default for Angular 4. And that's really all I really wanted to show you with this simple example, is that you could use the app-based reference for your routing. Okay, moving on to the next example. Next example is a navigate example. So let's take a look at the index. It has an app route. There's a main driver program. I'm going to just format this real quick. Okay, I have an app module. I'm bootstrapping it. And let's see what this looks like. So the app module is here. Okay, so okay, we don't need any of this stuff. I'm just going to take this out. We have an ng module, browser module, location strategy is back to the hash location strategy. Routes and router modules is imported. We have an app component, home, product, services, and we have a route. And I have a path for the home component, path for the products component, path for the service component. Everything down here is pretty much the same. And my app component, home component, products component, service component are custom components, but I'm bootstrapping my app component. So that's my root component. So let me go take a look at that one. And notice here, this is my app route selector. I have a router link to home, a router link to services, and this time I have an input button which can view the product page. When I click on the button, it invokes this function called navigate to products. And what I've done is I've implemented a function inside my app component. And there's a couple of things I do here, but essentially to navigate to products is using the router and using the navigate function on the router to actually go to the products page. Now notice in the constructor of the app component, I have defined here a private keyword on this router, and TypeScript, what TypeScript does is says, okay, I'm going to implicitly generate an underscore router member of this class, because now this function here is actually doing a this dot underscore router and navigating. Okay, so the application is just demonstrating that we could navigate explicitly if we want. Now notice the router is getting injected into my constructor. I didn't really do anything here to indicate that I needed a provider for the router getting injected. And that's the same thing for the HTTP service, etc. Okay, where are we now? Okay, we're in the wrong project, so let's try navigating to the next project. And start it. And once again, I do have to define the routes with all the paths, because the navigate function has got to navigate to one of the paths. Notice I've used some styles here for these components, and And I also have a style sheet out here for the index.html. And there's some things I didn't discuss yet, which we'll discuss in the future, and it has to do with the view encapsulation. And there's ways to encapsulate the styles for a component, the component tree, or isolate the styles for a particular child component by changing this view encapsulation. It has to do with the shadow DOM that's rendering in the browser, and we'll discuss that soon as well. Okay, so here we are. Okay, so here's my page. Here's my home component, showed up by default. My services component. Now here's my product page. Okay, and I used a button because I'm explicitly navigating there. We definitely don't want to use the hashtag here. I just it's appearing in all the examples, but really we don't want to see that. We never had a problem with it, but you definitely want to use the default. Okay, so let's go now look at the next example. The next example is route params. So let's go there. I'm going to start it, and let's look at the code. So this is an important example because we pass parameters using this example, and it's very important passing parameters in Angular 4 applications. Okay, so we start with an index, we have an app route, we have a main driver, we look at our CLI JSON file, we have a main driver of our Angular app. So we go to the main driver, we look at it, make sure we understand it. It's bootstrapping an app module. The app module is basically using the same things that we were using in the other examples, only there's a new component, a product detail component, param. And the routes that we describe are the default route, home component, a service path to a services component. And then what we do is we have a path here which says if you do a product / number, it'll go to the product detail component param. And then I could also pass additional data, and I'm passing an array of JSON objects, and I'm just making a simple example where my in-stock value is true. So when I go to this this particular, any URL that looks like a product / number, it'll hit on the component, and we're going to go get a parameter, which is that number, out of the component, and we could also see this data. So let's go take a look and see how we do that. Anything else going on down here? Nothing. We're bootstrapping the app component. So let's go look at the app component. And what I do in the app component is I have a selector, which is an app route. I have a template, a path to home, a path to services, and my path to product has a router link, and in the router link I put the path as well as a parameter. And this parameter could come from an attribute in my app component object. But right now we're just hard coding it. So let's take a look at that. So let's take a look at the home object. It just says, well, I'm the home component. This is home. And the products object, same thing. I'm the products component. This is the content of the products page. Services, this is the service component, content of the services page. And the product param is a little bit different. It has its own template. And the template basically says, this is my product ID. So let's look at the component definition. It has a product ID attribute, an in-stock Boolean attribute, and it's passed an activated route that gets injected into the constructor function. I use the route function to get a snapshot, dot params, and get the ID. That's the product ID that's being passed via the URL. And then I get a snapshot of the route, and I get the data called in stock, the first array element of the data, which is called in stock. I log the in stock, and now the product ID and the in stock are set in the component, and this way when the template is rendered, we render this string. This is the content product ID, and the syntax dynamically gets the value from the component and renders it via interpolation. And then I also say, oh, this is this product in stock, and I give an answer using the same dynamic binding to in stock. So let's see what that looks like. Okay, so I got a home component, I got a services component, and then I got a product component. Look at the product URL. It's passing this value, and the value goes into the component and gets rendered on the view. Okay, so you can pass parameters, you can get data. Let's move on to the next example. Okay, this is the router child example. I'm going to start it. And let's take a look at the code. Same thing, index.html main driver is the driver of my app. It's bootstrapping app module. App module has a routes definition. Okay, so I have a little bit more going on here. Okay, we do the same thing with location strategy, the routes to route module. We have an app component, home component, product detail component, product description component, a parts component, and a service component. So it's getting a little bit more complicated, but here's what the routing is. The routing says, okay, if there's nothing in this path, go to the home component. If there's a router link to services, go to the service component. And then there's a product ID component, go to the product detail component. And this has children. And so there's a child route here inside the product detail component. And so the path, there's a path, the default path goes to the product description component, and the parts has another parameter which passes the ID, which goes to the parts component. Once again, we define the route. We import the router module with the for routes passing in the routes. We have additional components here in the declarations, and once again, we're bootstrapping the app component. Okay, so let's go through this. Go through the app component. We're going to go down the tree. Here's the app component. It has a router outlet. The router link to home, router link to services, products passing at a number 23, which is the product ID, to a component. and then there's a router outlet. So let's go back real quick and look at this. Okay, you've got your path to home, a path to services, and your path to product detail component. Okay, so we know what home looks like, standard. We know what services look like, it's standard. We even kind of know what product looks like, but let's try to zoom in on that. This is the product detail. This is the product description. So let's see what product's pointing to. Product's pointing to product detail component. So here's the product detail component. Now this particular template has its own router. Okay, so first of all, let's go back here very quickly. Look at it again. Product passes an ID to product detail component. This is product detail component. The product detail component constructor takes the active route and grabs the parameter and puts it in product ID. Then it renders it within the template using the double curly bracket dynamic binding. I'm dynamically binding the attribute of the product detail component to the template. And there's also a route here. What shows up in this route by default? Let's go back here. By default, the product description component shows up. Product description component just basically says, this is the product, Harley Davidson motorcycle. I'm describing myself in a simple way. But there's also a router link here, which will link the parts component passing in a value, and that will get rendered in this router outlet, the child router outlet. So let's see, for parts, I have a parts component and I'm passing an ID. So let's take a look and see what happens to this application. Okay, so basically it's defaulted to products. Let me go back and look at the home component. I click on services, I go to a service component. I click on product information, I go to a product information component which has its own router. The green area is its own router. So first I get the product information for product 23, and it's shown me it's a Harley Davidson motorcycle. Now if I want to look at the parts info, I click on this and it shows the part info. So product ID and product ID and parts ID could be different, but maybe I represented this a little bit incorrectly. So let me just make it inconsistent. Let me make it a little bit consistent. It'll probably be confusing either way, but let me go back and make this 23 and see what happens. It recompiles. And let me go through the motions again. I guess I shouldn't have done that. There's some weird caching going on with Webpack. And even if I clear cache in a browser and try to re-render, sometimes I have problems. And I didn't have those problems with Live Server, so and I don't care what the issue is right now because things are going to change next week. So let me just see what happens if I try to re-render this thing, and if it doesn't work, we're going to move on. Home component, services component, product ID, parts info, product ID. Okay, so let's now move on to the next example. So the last example is an auxiliary route, and let me just move into that. Let me start it. Okay, so let's take a look at the source code. Okay, so we have an index.html with an app root. We have the CLI, which is saying our main driver is main TS. Here's my driver. It's bootstrapping the app module. And here's my app module. And it has routes. It has a path, which redirects to home. And it has a path match full. And we have a path home, which goes to a home component. We have a chat component, which has an outlet AUX. Okay, so let's look at the components. We have an app component, and we have a router link to home, a router link to a primary home, and an auxiliary chat. And if you click on this open chat, both of these outlets will render. And then if you close chat, the aux will be set to null and it will close. So here we have our two routes, router outlet name aux. Let's take a look at what it looks like. Here's our home component. Let's open our chat. Here's our chat component. So we have two router outlets open now. Now we close chat. Open chat. Okay, so that's just a little demonstration of an auxiliary route. And that is all we wanted to cover today. Stay tuned for the next presentation or tutorial on routing. We're going to go into much more detail in other features. Thank you very much.